Yes.
Okay, great.
Sorry about all the problems, you guys. Oh,
We're all going to be experts with this when it's all said and done.
I blame everything on COVID and 2020. So yeah. All right. Well, take it over.
All right. All right. I'm assuming y'all can see my screen there.
Yes.
So this is a presentation that we've put together for, for groups like yourselves. Last time I gave it was in May to the El Paso chapter. There might be a few slides related more towards that neck of the woods than up here. I apologize if so. I just haven't had a chance to go through and update everything. So with that, we'll get started. So first off, what is a forest? We have the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. It's basically our National Forest Census. The FIA, they provide objective and scientific information on key forest ecosystems, their processes, how much of the forest there is, what it looks like, is it increasing or decreasing, are we gaining or losing species, that sort of thing. So FIA has several different definitions of what is a forest. If you're in East Texas, you have a lot more rainfall, you have a lot denser tree cover. So out in East Texas, our FIA's program's definition is a forest is forest land that has at least 10% cover of trees of any size. That ends up being about 60 seedlings per acre. That includes land that formerly had trees on it and that will eventually have trees grow back onto it naturally. If it's something like they've paved over for a parking lot, they won't consider that forest land. In East Texas, we have a little bit different, or excuse me, not East Texas, West Texas, we have a little bit different definition. Because it's a lot less dense, they use the rubric of 5% crown cover, or about 40 seedlings per acre. And that's just because of the different climates, different environments. We want to make sure, they want to make sure they're capturing as much of forest land and growth as they can by making those calls. So we have several different types of forests. There are industrial forests or plantations. These are, where our forest products come from, the paper, the lumber, the pulpwood, that sort of thing. We also have our non-industrial private forests. These are forests that are generally owned and managed by private individuals. They tend to keep these for one or more purposes. Maybe it's, their family legacy. Maybe they're keeping it just because they like forests, and they want, some hunting or recreational land. I know out in this, in the Southeast, I moved from South Carolina before coming back to Texas. There's lots of little families there that, have 40, 50 acres of forested land they're keeping as kind of their retirement or the kids' college fund, that sort of thing. So there's lots of different reasons why individual might maintain their own private forests. And then we also have our public forests, which can be managed as wilderness or preserves or a combination of both. And then after that, we have our urban forests. When people think of forests, they don't really think, as urban areas having forests. But when we look back at that definition of forest land from FIA, it doesn't really define the forest as being in an urban or rural setting. It's just based on that density of the canopy cover. So these urban forests, they can be the parks, the trees along the street. If your neighborhood has a lot of trees in it, in everybody's yards, that can be considered a forested area. It's pretty broad definition. So there are several regions in Texas that are forested. Generally, we have a dividing line between East Texas and then the Central and West Texas regions. You can kind of see that dividing line on this graphic here. As you see, the Central West Texas portion takes up a much larger part of the state than that East Texas portion. But the majority of our lumber industry all happens in that East Texas portion. That's kind of why we delineate it that way. As you can see, that's our pine woodlands region. We have 7 different ecoregions in the state, and each of those can actually have a different FIA forest type group, or they can have several of those different forest types. You see here we have the pine woods, the coastal woodlands. Moving on, west, you get into the post oaks, the hackberry oak, the mesquite juniper, and then the high plains region where we're at, and then the mountains out far west. These forest type groups, these are generally right here what we see. Generally what I would call the forest types that they're going to see up here in the panhandle where I'm at, South Plains region where you are at. Generally it's going to be that pinyon juniper. There's going to be some other forest types that pop up here and there, or certain regions that might have a little bit different forest types, but predominantly it's going to be that pinyon juniper, and then also some of the hardwood, riparian, and some of those drainages. So in East Texas, we have 12 million acres of timberland. That's 53% of the total area of that East Texas region. Out there, pine is going to be our most abundant species, taking up about 45% of that, followed by oak hickory, oak pine, and then oak gum cypress combinations of forest types. And then we have other forest types as well. So moving over to Central and West Texas area, there we have 50 million acres of forest land, but it only makes up about 33% of the area. So, it's a lot more spread out. Mesquite is by far our most abundant species in the entire Central West Texas area. Anybody that's lived in Central or West Texas for any length of time probably already knows that. Makes up about 21 million acres. Next, we have the juniper pine types. That's about 20% of the area, followed closely by our oak forest types and other hardwood forest types. And then interestingly enough, we have a small portion, 7%, which is considered non-stocked. That non-stocked, that's that category I talked about earlier, where it's forest land that, it could support a forest. If you just leave it alone and don't do anything, forest will come back. There's just nothing there right now. So we've talked about what a forest is a little bit, talked about the differences between East and Central and West Texas. So let's talk about just the general, life cycle of the forest. A forest ecosystem is a interacting population of plants and animals and microorganisms. Oh, I'm sorry. I got a call from Kipra here. Let me see if we're having an issue. All right, sorry about that. Just want to make sure everybody's able to get into the room. Feel free to message me if there's any issues that you see pop up. All right, so where were we? Forest ecology. So yes, the forest ecosystem is that interaction of the plants, the animals, the microorganisms, the soil, the natural environment, the climate, the sunlight, the water, everything. Our ecosystem is that natural community. All those living things, they need the soil, they need the water, the nutrients, the oxygen. What forests do is they create a vertical structure. Not only do they make very efficient use of the land by allowing it, nature to go up as well as out. And then, that vertical structure actually creates microclimates and changes the weather patterns and in those areas, and it creates little niches for many different species to basically thrive. So healthy forests can support a wide variety of wildlife habitat. This is usually demonstrated by our indicator species. Indicator species is something that ecologists and natural resource professionals always look at when they are looking at any kind of land, whether it's forest or rangeland. There's just certain species of animals that, if you see them there, you've got a pretty healthy ecosystem going on. They're species that have a narrow tolerance of what they can live in. So their absence there tells you, or I mean, not their absence, their presence there tells you that, hey, it's got everything it needs, and this is a species that's supposed to be here, so everything's good. And when we see that indicator species disappear, then we know that we may be having an issue or a change in the environment that we need to take a closer look at what's going on. So forests are constantly changing. They're growing. Things happen in the environment. You have, big disturbances, minor disturbances, and that changes the composition of the forest and its structure. As stands of trees mature, some species will die out. Some species will be, overcrowded or just not quite suited to that area anymore as that forest moves into more mature forest type. So one of the pressures we see on forests is natural disasters. Since 2000, Texas forests have been damaged by all sorts of things. We've got ice and hailstorms, tornadoes, hurricanes, really destructive wildfire years, and we had drought in 2011. This first photo here, this is the Baird Creek fire, which happened on September 13th of 2011. Got this here. This is a picture storm damage from Rita. Then this was back in 2005. The damage from Harvey, similar type of damage we were seeing with that. And then this last photo here, this is our picture of drought just in those East Texas pine forests. You see all those trees dying. That 2011 drought, that killed 301 million trees here in Texas. And in our rural forest, that ended up being about 6% of our trees. And then we also lost about 5.5 million in our urban forests, which ended up being about 10% of our urban forest trees. Just some quick estimates. The FIA in East Texas, said mortality in 2006 was about 0.7%. After those hurricanes came through, and in 2011, they said it had doubled to 1.2%, and then with the drought, it jumped up to almost 4.5%. So we're expecting a lot more drought in the next, several years, the next decade. The more drought we have, our direct impacts are, loss of growth, higher mortality rates. This impacts our fires. We will tend to have larger, more severe, longer lasting fires, longer fire seasons, and more fuel buildup. This chart here just shows our basic average annual mortality of hardwood trees, at least 5 inches in diameter. As you can see from it, the hardwood mortality has increased substantially in the past past several years. Much of that is related to weather. You can see that yellow line in the figure. It's going to be really spiked up after those hurricanes. But this is just increased mortality is dragging down our net growth of the forests. A lot of this was all happening before the big droughts in 2011. So, we've talked about those stresses. Now we're going to talk to, how a forest goes through its natural growth patterns, how a bare area of forest or a bare area of land becomes a nice big mature forest. It happens through a process called succession. Succession happens in any wild land area, and the end state is a mature forest, assuming that you have adequate resources and lack of disturbance, either man-made or natural. It's the orderly replacement of plants and animal species over time ends up into making its way to a stable, ecosystem that thrives and is balanced. So what primary succession is, it's when we have that catastrophic disturbance come in. We've talked about the hurricanes a bit. We talked about wildfires. It can be other things as well. I don't think we have too many volcanoes in Texas, but the way 2020 is going, I guess one could pop up somewhere. Again, avalanches and glaciers, we don't have that much of that here last I checked, but who knows? So this is just a quick little graphic, kind of give you an idea of how that succession works. In the number 1 box here, you have your happy, mature forest stand. Then as you can see, a wildfire comes in, a catastrophic wildfire, destroys everything, knocks it back to down to bare dirt. After that, you start getting your annual and perennial weeds and grasses that come in. Shrubs start moving in shortly after that. After those are established, you start getting your small tree seedlings. Over time, those tree seedlings grow up. They start shading out the shrubs, shading out the grasses more, and you start getting your young forest. You might start getting some mature trees in there. And then over time, you'll end up back with that mature forest. You'll see the same kind of thing happen in animal populations as well as plant communities. This graphic kind of gives you an actual timeline. It's good to say, oh, grasses come back and then the shrubs and then the trees, but how long does that take? As you can see here, that it can be a pretty long process, especially if you're looking at what you had before if it was maybe an old growth forest with a lot of hardwood trees. The hardwoods tend to take a lot longer to reach that mature stage. And so as you can see, your first 50 years or so, you're really in that beginning succession stages, and you're not really going to have a forest. It's after about 50, 60 years, that's when you start seeing the forest start to look more like a forest again. So our first stage in succession is the pioneer phase. This is when we're at bare dirt or ash or just really nothing left. after that big event. You have your pioneer species coming in first. These are the weeds, the grasses. These are species that need full sunlight. They don't really like competition with other species. They just don't do well. This is also where we get, in a forested land, our stand initiation. This is where we start getting the beginnings of what we call an even-aged forest. We get regeneration, from seeds built up in the soil, start sprouting up, and we get our small little trees starting. Generally, this tends to be pine, cedar type trees, not too many hardwoods, although you will get some. You start getting lots of fungi, lichens, mosses, and then a lot of the grasses. The fungi, the lichens, the moss, those are really breaking down all that dead or destroyed material and recycling it back into the soil, kind of renewing that soil, providing nutrients for the soil microbes and the soil biota to really get going again, to start building that soil back up so that it can support the plant community. You start having, they also help filter out the water, and provide for that as well. So in this pioneer stage, you get a lot of diversity of small wildlife. That you'll get your small rodents, your reptiles, burrowing animals, again, the microorganisms and earthworms. You might see some larger species, but generally it's going to be the smaller stuff that can kind of make use of those grasses and weeds and hide among them. And make homes in them. So after that pioneer stage, we get our early stage. That's where we get, these secondary species coming in. That's where we start getting the perennials coming in. You start seeing some more, those saplings that start to pop up a little bit taller. You start seeing some shrubs and other woody type plants. That provides a lot more food sources for wildlife. So therefore you start getting a even bigger array of wildlife coming in. You start seeing a little bit bigger animals. You start seeing stuff like rabbits, small herbivores. Birds will start coming in, more insects. And you'll start to see also the associated small predators that come with that, like the fox and the coyote. This is where, again, we had the initial pine and cedar will start coming back in that pioneer stage. In this early stage, this is where they really start to become established. Those types of trees generally don't like being shaded out and will end up being suppressed in a older forested type area where they don't get full sun. So our next stage, successionary stage, is the middle stage. This is actually kind of where a lot of Central and West Texas kind of stops. Again, succession will keep continuing to a mature uneven forest stage, assuming that you have enough resources, the climate's right, gets enough rainfall, has enough soil nutrients, and you don't have any big disturbances that knock that succession stage back. So really, in a lot of areas of Central and West Texas, we kind of are stuck in this successional stage here, just because there's not enough water to really support the larger late stage climax forest that you see further east. This middle stage, you're going to have to start having those pines, junipers form an actual canopy. You'll have some of the hardwood saplings and tree species that are, can't tolerate full sun when they're initially getting established, start to pop up in that understory. But also that canopy buildup will start to shade out the forest floor there. And so you also will have some areas where, the grasses get knocked back, the shrubs get knocked back. It kind of, slows down some of those competing factors. These canopies do give that shelter to those young hardwoods, allowing them to get really established and start thriving and growing up as well. At this point, you start getting edge areas. Edge areas are the transition area between a forested area and an open area, tend to be much denser with a lot more understory growth. They're like buffet lines for wildlife. Lots of wildlife use the edges. You'll see deer come in. The deer like those edge areas. You'll start seeing more rodents and squirrels and bird species. Some bigger mammals come in, and then by extension, you'll start seeing even bigger predators come in as well. So, assuming all of our resources are in abundance, and we don't have any disturbances, we would move from that middle successional stage into the late successional stage or the climax stage. In our eastern forests, a lot of, and I'm saying eastern forests for the whole US, our dominant species tends to be oak and hickory. In our western forest and southern forest, it's really more oak pine mixture. These late successional stage forests, these are our older growth forests. You tend to have, they tend to become uneven aged forests. And that's where, some of our climax trees, they'll get old and die out, or they'll get diseased, or you'll have, maybe some trees that were suppressed, because they were outcompeted or just too shaded, will die. They'll drop, and it'll open up gaps in the forest floor, which will allow sunlight and allow a new round of succession to begin. And so then you basically get what we call that uneven aged forest. And an uneven aged forest is a kind of what you want to see in a natural forest. It's the best balance. It's the healthiest forest type. If you have an uneven aged forest with lots of old growth in it, you've got a pretty good ecosystem going on there. And again, your wildlife, you're going to just have anything and everything you would expect to see in a forest in these uneven aged climax successional stage forested areas. So that's a primary succession that we had talked about. In large forested areas, we also have minor disturbance succession. This is kind of like what I was just talking about, where you have the dead trees fall and leave gaps in that canopy. It can also happen can happen through insects or disease, lightning strikes, wind, ice, maybe a small fire that gets put out quickly. Anyway, smaller, weaker trees will die out, leave those gaps. You start getting more of that light and water down into the forest floor, and that's where you get these nice little pastures spring up. You start seeing that successionary stage start all over again, but at a smaller scale, not at a full landscape scale. So now that's how a forest grows and moves through its stages. To help the forest along, we need to manage it. There's lots of things that the trees do for us, so we need to do what we can for them to help maintain a healthy habitat and to really keep our forested lands. As you can see from this list, everybody knows we get the wood to build our houses, that we get the paper. They also help pull down soil and return nutrients into the soil, clean our water, provide habitat to the wildlife. Trees make oxygen, always a good thing. And we can also get some medicinal products from trees as well. So a forest, well-maintained, managed forest gives us lots of benefit. So that's the benefit for us to manage it effectively. So there's different types of forest management. It all depends on what exactly the goals are for that forest. Multi-use management is where the landowner manages their forest with several different objectives in mind. It might be that timber production, it might be as some kind of investment property or for hunting land or recreational land, other considerations. And you see this a lot with publicly owned forests, is it, provides wildlife habitat, erosion control, helps clean up water and helps maintain water quality, and it does provide those nice recreational activities for us. So forest management is called silviculture. Silva coming from the Latin word for forest. So silviculture is the planting, growing, tending, and harvesting of stands of trees. What the different silvicultural techniques that we apply will determine what kind of forest products we're getting. It'll also, those techniques will tell us what practices to use and what kind of regeneration methods we're going to look at. These techniques can influence the species composition, the structure, the health, the growth rates, what kind of products we are going to get out of that forested area, and also the wildlife habitat for that area. So in industrial forests and wood production forests, generally what they use is even-aged management. There's a couple different techniques to it, but basically the idea is all the trees are either allowed to naturally regenerate or they're artificially planted all at one time. This ends up producing trees of equal age, but they won't necessarily be of equal size. Some will do well with where they end up planted. Others will end up being outcompeted or just might not quite have enough resources in their location. But overall, the tree stands will look pretty uniform. They will require thinnings throughout the rotation to encourage the best growth of their crop, of the trees that they plan on harvesting for that lumber use. This is where we get wood fibers for our paper and pulpwood products and our lumber. So a typical rotation, it can vary by region, by species. This right here is a 40-year rotation. This is generally what we see used in pine plantations. The first first 10 years are the establishment phase. It's where you go in, you're planting your seedlings and just letting them get going. Within that first, after they get about 10 years to get established, you're going to have a very thick, even-aged forested area. So you need to go in and within, between years 10 and 15, you're going to do your first thinning cut. And then you're going to follow up at year 20 with another thinning cut. And then really basically you do a thinning cut every 10 years until you get to that year 40 and you're ready for your full harvest. At that point, you'll go in and you'll clear cut the whole area and then replant and start over again. So these intermediate cuttings, they're called pre-commercial thinnings. This is where we get a lot of our pulpwood and fibers for paper products and other pulpwood products. This happens a lot in again, like I said, the pine plantations. What they do is it thins out the smaller trees, the trees that aren't necessarily straight or that might be a little bit sick or that just aren't doing well as the ones around it. This reduces the trees on the better tree. It reduces competition on the better trees, which allows them to keep going strongly. And also allows the producer to get their machinery in there to maintain the forest and do other activities such as collecting pine straw. In the South, collecting that longleaf pine straw and putting it out in your garden every fall is a big industry, and it's something that helps these smaller forest tracts and these smaller producers to make it through these 40-year rotations until they get their big payday. And all those trees that get pulled out through these thinnings, they're not just gotten rid of. They do sell them off again for the pulp and paper products. You might get a little bit of small, firewood or little bits of usable lumber, but these thinnings are more to provide the best harvest for when they're ready for that big harvest of trees at year 40. It's kind of just gives them a little bit of resources to keep things going because it is such a time-intensive process. So, after our intermediate cuttings, we get to that clear cutting stage. Clear cutting is where they go in and they take out all the economically mature trees in the stand and they harvest them for use. This will end up creating a new even-age stand because you're going to either go back and replant it, or you're going to allow natural regeneration depending on what techniques you're using. And that's all part of the management plan as well as available resources for the landowner. This technique is used with species that are good, getting that full sunlight, that really need and want that full sunlight to get established in their seedling stage. And when they do go back and restock, they tend to go in and plant a lot more seedlings than would typically be recommended. Plant them really closely together. And they're trying to account for, hey, over the next 10 years, we're going to lose some of these trees. And then they also know that they are going to be doing those thinnings periodically. So just make sure that they have a good crop of trees to start out with so that when they do get to that end stage of the rotation, they've still got a good amount of trees to make it worth the cost and effort. This clear cutting event, it mimics that catastrophic disturbance we were talking about, that fire, that hurricane, that volcano. And so this is kind of where we're seeing that successional stage start over again. So a little bit of a variation to the clear cutting technique is the seed tree technique. It's still a clear cutting technique, but what they do is they leave, about 10 or so of your best trees in each acre. And the idea is that you're leaving those trees that did the best, that are the best looking trees, to drop their seed. And you give them a couple years and allow that seed to establish the next, the seedlings for the next rotation. Those new seedlings will be considered an even age stand because they're all dropping and getting established about the same time. Once you do have that stand established, you'll go back and you will cut down those seed trees and harvest them because they are valuable trees. It's just kind of trying to leave the best to make sure that you continue to have a well-rounded product, the best product you can produce. Another technique is what they call the shelter wood system. This also, this includes, this is where you basically go and you do a partial cutting in the forested area throughout the rotation. You might go in and say, all right, we're going to take out every tree that's, X height and X amount of inches in diameter. And so that's going to allow them to, one, make money off that stand and keep the cash flow going to, maintain that forest. But it also allows some light to reach that forest floor and get some of the natural regeneration started. So it kind of makes it so that once you do end up taking out all the mature trees, you have all your seedlings are already established and ready to go. So it can kind of help to shorten up that rotation time a little bit. So, we've been talking about even age management. Again, this is more industry practices for, like pine plantations, tree species that are, the seedlings want that full sunlight. Another type of management is uneven age management. This is more forestry side of the house. This is more managing for, a public forest, or if you're primarily a producer of some of the hardwood species, the more expensive stuff, but it's also the slower growing stuff. Takes a lot more time to reach that mature size and get to a size that's really worth it economically to harvest. So single tree selection is where the forester will go in and say, like, okay, we are selecting this year, we're going to be cutting out, we're going to be harvesting this species of tree. It might be because that species is getting a little too much, dominant in that stand and starting to, outcompete the other species. Or if you're in a commercial operation, it might be that that's the most lucrative species to be harvesting right now. And they'll go in and they'll, select those mature trees that are the best for their requirements. Generally, again, certain size, class, certain diameter, trunk diameter. So you're not going to even necessarily take out all the trees of that species, but you're only going to take out the biggest, best trees, for your operation, or the trees that are going to, the forest is really going to benefit from having removed from them. This encourages that uneven age by having those different successional layers there. And it actually allows more wildlife species to come in. Another technique for the uneven aged forest management is using group selection. This is where the forester will go in and select area where they'll remove all the trees of any species in a certain small area. So it's not a large clear-cut type. It's more of like, a field type, a pasture type size, where they'll create these little pockets where they're in the canopy that'll again allow this regeneration to begin. It'll allow, a section of the forest to have, different age class and size, and also create some edge area, which is really good for wildlife. As I said before, wildlife really love those edges, creates lots of food sources and cover sources for wildlife. So it's really beneficial to use this technique when your main goal is management of the wildlife in the area. So, that's a few techniques. We're going to talk, we're going to touch on reforestation a little bit here. As you can see from this map, it goes from 1925 to 2010. And you see how much reforestation we have by thousands of acres over those years. You see in the early part of the 20th century, there just really wasn't that much going on. That's because we had all these old growth forests. We had lots of forests. And so the industry was coming in and clear cutting large areas. Well, as they went on, they started noticing, hey, it's not quite regenerating the way we expected it to. And if we keep on in this manner, we're not going to have anywhere to go back and collect trees for lumber or paper products. And the industry saw this as a problem. You'll see where it really starts picking up there is in the 60s and 70s. This is also the same time frame. We started getting a lot of our environmental laws on the books. But the industry really stepped up here because the majority of our timberland here in Texas is privately owned, either by different industries or by individual landowners with their non-industrial private lands. And as you can see, they've been responsible for most of the reforestation efforts in Texas. And they're what's keeping our forests really alive and going and allowing that timber industry to stay alive in East Texas. So we discussed fire a little bit, and you can't really talk about forests or anything in land management without discussing fire. fire is a natural part of the landscape. Different areas have different periods when wildfires would naturally go through them if, you know, left unchecked and man were not a factor. Grasslands tend to be every 1 to 2 years. Forests tend to be every 3 to 5 years or so, maybe a little bit longer depending on the forest type and region. And basically this is beneficial to the forest because it reduces fuel buildup. And that as those fuels build up, if the fire is suppressed, that creates what with the in the wildland firefighting they call ladder fuels, which is where you have dead stuff that allows that fire to get up into the tree canopy. You get a fire in a tree canopy, that's how you lose an entire forest very quickly. That's kind of what they're having a lot of trouble with happening out in California and Colorado. That's what we had trouble with the Bastrop wildfires back in 2011. So since we can't just let natural wildfires go crazy because, you know, we have infrastructure, people's homes, buildings, businesses, we really need to introduce prescribed fire into the mix. Again, this helps reduce those fuels. A lot of times you see it done more in pine forests because pine forests are really adapted to that forest fire. The bark of the pine tree is designed to handle a fire moving through it quickly. Now, if the fire sits at the base of the tree for hours and hours and hours, that's when we have issues and trees catch on fire. Again, that's due to the buildup of that fuel in the understory. In fact, you know, some species of trees, you know, coniferous species, a lot of them actually need that fire to come through the forest to start regeneration. They rely on that fire to open up the pine cones and release the seeds. So, you know, when we remove fire as that management tool, we tend to have more uncontrolled wildfires because of that buildup of those fuels, especially when we get into drought years. Back in 2011, we had really bad drought. We also had really bad wildfire year that year. And that's, you know, you can kind of see from this map, I know it's a lot of numbers and a lot of red. Basically what it's telling us is the areas that are very, you know, have a high drought conditions, and, you know, basically all that fuel is super dry. It's kindling, just waiting to go up. You see the this is from that 2011 fire season. This is the number of resources either sent to or requested from each state in the country through TIC, which is the Texas Interagency Coordination Center. This is the main center that is used for emergency management in Texas for any kind of natural disaster event. Whenever we have a wildfire, our wildfire crews are dispatched through TIC. If we have a big event, they'll call in resources from other parts of the state or other states. Or if other states are having big events, they'll send resources from Texas out to them. But again, you know, you remove normal prescribed burns and you start getting some really bad fuel buildup, which again, it's just going to end up blowing up. This is a picture of Bastrop during the forest fire. And, you know, here's some other pictures of just catastrophic wildfires. And again, in a lot of instances, you know, not always, but this is a consequence of no fire at all. It is important to do those prescribed burns properly and well controlled as necessary to keep a large scale event from happening. So now we've talked about the fires for a little bit, and that's kind of hard to look at, especially in light of everything that's been going on out on the West Coast and up in Colorado lately. Let's move on more to kind of the value that trees give us. The FIA is actually kind of estimated how much we get from a monetary aspect from our rural and urban forested areas in Texas. This is, several years old, but it still gives you just an idea of the amount of money we either save or services, we get in a kind of a monetarized way. So we have different services here. We have the watershed that includes water capture and filtration, and also, having these forested areas help prevent major flooding a lot of times by slowing down water as it's moving through the area and allowing it to absorb more into the soil. We have our, climate services. That's, scrubbing of the absorption of the greenhouse gases. We have our biodiversity aspect. That's, the contribution towards our wildlife and maintaining that those wildlife communities in a healthy manner. And this also takes in, to account the cost of conserving them versus the cost of deforesting. Then there's the cultural aspects. Everybody, people like going out in the forest. People like camping and hunting and learning about it. And there's the heritage part of it. And then there's also the air quality services. This is the heat island reduction that we get. The capture of those carbon emissions, the absorption of other pollutants as well as the carbon monoxide. Trees help filter out all sorts of pollutants from the atmosphere, which help offset our activities as humans that, what we've put into the air over the years. So all total, they figured about $93 billion a year was the value of the services that the 62 million acres or so of rural forests, or rural and urban forests in Texas provided to the state. That's quite a bit of money and quite a good reason to keep our trees and our forests healthy and keep them maintained and try to promote them as best as we can. Something we talked about was heat island reduction. Here's a study that that we found that has been done on heat island reduction and reducing overall temperatures in an area. Heat island is something you generally see in larger urban areas. You get the massive people, lots of concrete, lots of buildings, lots of ACs running, lots of power being used, vehicles being used. It creates these little pockets where the overall temperature tends to be hotter. You can actually kind of see it a lot of times on the Doppler. You see the big storm coming. I don't know if it happens down in Lubbock that much, but here in Amarillo, it happens all the time. It's like, oh, good, nice thunderstorms coming through. We really need that. And then it just creates, you look at the Doppler and there's a hole in the middle of the radar where it all just kind of dissipates over the city. That's the heat island effect. That's where the temperature in the city is significantly hotter than the surrounding area, and it can change the weather patterns. So these studies showed that in several different trials of different types of trees, different locations, they did studies over several years just to see, okay, how much does this really affect? How much does the shading of these trees, the extra moisture they keep in the soil and in the air, how much does this really affect the local climate in these areas? And as you can see, it was about a 15 to 30% decrease in overall heat in those areas. And that can lead to lower power usage costs, which saves carbon emissions. So as you can see, those urban trees are really important. These next few slides are going to be a little bit more far west Texas based. Again, I just didn't really have time to update them and over the last couple days. But they're all they kind of show the same viewpoint. So bear with me here. So one tree, if you take out the cost of maintaining that tree and then add in the benefits, you get a net of $37 per year. Figure an average tree is going to live 100, 120 years. It's about $4,000 a tree. So one tree times 100, as you can see, that can add up quickly. So 100 trees, which is about 1 acre forested land, according to our East Texas definitions, can absorb the amount of CO2 of one car that's driven for 26,000 miles in a year. So 100 trees or 1 acre of trees can offset one car. You have 100 acres of forest, it's 100 cars. As you can see, this adds up really quickly. That's 25,000 pounds of pollutants. You also are able to retain over 3.5 million gallons of stormwater just from that 100 acres of forested area. A major study in Chicago showed that trees in that city annually removed 15 metric tons of carbon monoxide, 84 tons of sulfur dioxide, 89 tons of nitrogen dioxide, just a lot of contaminants from the atmosphere, tons and tons and tons of contaminants just from that one city. The estimated value of that pollution removal was $1 million for trees just from the city itself. And then for the entire Chicago area is about $10 million just from the pollution removal aspect. So, increasing our tree cover by about 10%, citywide, about 3 trees or so per building can greatly reduce cooling costs. They estimate about 10%. If you think about this at a national level, that's billions of dollars in energy costs saved annually. Additionally, if we were to plant 7 million shade trees in strategic energy saving locations, we could eliminate the need for a large power plant. So as you can see, this understanding this economic value of sustaining these trees, can kind of help us see the benefits they provide to all of us. So here we are again. Like I said, this is more El Paso based. I did a quick search trying to see kind of what tree cover is in Lubbock. Some of my software that I use needed to be updated, so I'm waiting to get an update link. I wasn't able to find urban tree cover for Lubbock, but for those of you that have been to El Paso, they have a tree cover of about 5.1%. That 5% out there gives them, an annual value of about $250,000 in pollution removal. And then here's some more numbers: the stormwater retention that they get, the carbon sequestration, and then just the overall energy savings from lower energy usage due to that shading. So, they out there in El Paso with that 5% tree cover, they say they get about $6 million in value. I wasn't able, again, to run all these numbers, but I was able to find the tree cover or the urban tree canopy numbers for Canyon, And y'all might be more familiar with Canyon. It's just south of Amarillo here, about, I don't know, 15, 20 miles. Canyon has an 11% tree cover, totaling about 1,200 acres. And their estimated net, their estimated value of the eco services that those trees provide is $1.5 million just for the little town of Canyon, Texas. So, an area like Lubbock, which is going to have better tree cover than El Paso, it's roughly, it's a good sized city. Y'all are going to get a lot of value in that area from having that increased tree cover. Here's just a few more figures from El Paso. They've got 1.2 million trees, 5%. So the replacement value of those trees would be $1 billion. And then the carbon storage, how much, they're not just pulling the carbon out of the air, they're sequestering it away so that it doesn't get re-emitted. That's another $6 million in that structural value, which, the total structural value of that forest is $1.5 billion. So, again, that's El Paso, so you can imagine what it would be for the South Plains region. I know we're more grasslands up here, but we have a lot more trees than people think. That's something that I've noticed, and something I have to tell people when I travel around. So with that, that's my presentation. Does anybody have any questions? Anything they want to ask? Here, let me see if I can return control. All right, Kipra, I'm gonna transfer the host back to you, okay? I think you're muted.
There we go. Okay, now can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, there's some questions. Do you have any data on the different Earth Day, the difference that Earth Day makes for tree benefits? Does Earth Day do anything for us? I guess it's
it does. I mean, I don't have any hard numbers right now, but the thing is it's, raising awareness, and that's the big thing, is raising awareness. There's actually, not just Earth Day, the Arbor Day stuff. It helps encourage people to at least think about it, and think about their behaviors. And it can actually be kind of hard to measure that stuff, because we just had Texas Arbor Day last Friday. I went out and planted a tree, but that didn't get captured anywhere on any data. So, the main benefit is it gives us a vehicle to make people think about, trees, make people think about their environment, and kind of give them a kind of a nudge, so to speak, to, go out and do something or make that difference, even if it's just a little bit.
Hi, Kevin. You mentioned, or I think it was on a chart, that vegetation kills trees? Is that like ivy or honeysuckle, or what is that that kills them?
Different things. You know, especially when we're talking about like seedlings, uh, just grasses can kill trees.
Oh,
If you have a little seedling here that's, this tall, and you've got grasses all around it, and those grasses grow a lot faster, and so they take a lot more water and resources, and so really, and different things can kill the trees. Trees are generally pretty hardy. That's how they get so big and strong.
right.
With mature trees, yeah, you'll have honeysuckles and some ivies. I know wisteria can be really bad. I know out in South Carolina, that was all pine forest out there when I lived there. And the wisteria wasn't native to that area, but people would plant it in their yards because they liked how it looked. It's pretty. I had some on my trees. I thought it was pretty, but I would also have to go out every year and really knock back those wisteria vines because the pine trees just weren't adapted to it, and they weren't able to handle it. And those vines would go in and they would choke out the trees. So, climbing vines, especially when it comes to mature trees, they can be a really big hazard, especially if it's, a species that isn't normal to that area, an invasive species that, doesn't have any kind of natural predator to knock it back. The vines, they'll encircle those trees and slowly constrict them, cutting off the flow of water and nutrients because with a tree, the main highway, for those water and nutrients is, right below the bark, in those outer layers. So it's really easy for that to get constricted off. And that'll kill a tree very quickly. Something I see quite often with urban trees is, not necessarily vines or grasses, is people will buy container trees and they'll pull them out of the container that they've been in at Lowe's or Home Depot or the nursery for, years. And they've got this massive tangled ball of roots and they just drop it in the ground. They might add some, soil nutrients and they'll give it water and they'll stake it, but they'll be root bound, and those roots will actually circle around the base of the tree. And if you don't watch it when you plant them, you could end up with the tree choking itself off in the same manner. So, I mean, really anything could be a hazard, just depending on when it gets to the tree. We have our nursery down out there in Idalou, where we grow all our seedlings for windbreak trees and for our various projects throughout the state. And one of our biggest problems out there is we have a prairie dog town. And so the back 40 acres, we can't, we would like to use it as to grow a little bit bigger trees than just seedlings, but prairie dogs don't like trees. And if you go and plant a seedling out there, they will get out there and they will chew that, they'll take that seedling right out of the ground. And unfortunately, since we're an educational organization, we're not allowed to, we're limited in our methods that we can use to remove them. But that's a battle they fight yearly out there at the nursery. And it's not just the prairie dogs. We kind of just let them have their back pasture and we'll figure that out later. But we have issues with rabbits and mice in our hard house. All our seedlings go from our greenhouse into the hard house, hardening off house, which is, it's basically like a giant pergola, slatted roof. It gets a little bit of sunlight, but it's still kind of shaded, trying to harden off the trees to get them ready for being out in the environment. Rabbits and the mice will get in there all the time and chew up those trees. So it really just depends on what's going on in the environment and where the tree is at in its growth stage.
Okay, and then one other thing, you mentioned indicator species. So what kind of indicator species do we have around our neck of the quote, quote, woods that would show us that our trees are doing well?
Right. I'd have to look for, a list for the, kind of the forest ecosystems because, again, we don't have big forested ecosystems. We
Exactly.
have small little pockets here and there. I do know as just a general indicator for the Panhandle and High Plains. I know for like rangeland, a good indicator is the horned lizard. Uh,
Okay.
uh, that is considered an indicator species. They have a very narrow tolerance of what of the environments they can live in. So if you have those, you see them start to go away, tells you something's wrong. They're very sensitive to pollution. That's
Mm.
the big one for them. As far as in our forested areas, I'd have to look into that a little bit more, and I'd be happy to do that. I'll look into that tomorrow a little bit, and I'll send an email to Kipra if that's all right with you, Kipra. Just kind of as a follow up. I had a list of different indicator species for different areas of Texas, but it can be a lot. I mean, it can be a certain type of
Mm.
grass, a certain type of tree. It doesn't necessarily have to be an animal. It can be a certain type of flower. So if you take all that into account, I mean, there's for every area, there's going to be a list a mile long. But yeah, I'll try to find some good ones, something y'all would be familiar with, and send them over to you, just so y'all can kind of have an idea, look for that, or if you see something and you're like, oh, we used to have that, but we don't. That can kind of tell you, hey, you know, that's something that's might be an issue. I know in riparian, like bottomland areas, like along creek beds and stream beds, a big one for those types of areas is fireflies.
Um,
Fireflies can be an indicator species of the health of that area, of that ecosystem. And that's something that throughout the country we're seeing, a lot of those going away as well. Uh, so yeah, like I said, it depends on what area in particular you're talking about. So,
okay. Thank you.
mm-hmm.
Let's see, we have one more question. Without going into too much detail, what is your job, Kevin?
Okay. So I'm a part of my department is forest resource development. It's, entails anything having to do with trees that isn't wildfire related. So for the Amarillo region, and again, like I said, I'm covering the South High Plains region until we get a new forester in there. Basically, what my job entails is, doing educational events like these for you guys, for anybody that wants them. Really, I'll go speak to 4-H clubs. I'll go speak to schools. I'll do town meetings. I've done a lot of different things. We'll host events, tree events. We just hosted one a couple weeks ago for pesticide applicators with the city of Amarillo to help give them their continuing education and give them a little more information on, how to properly use pesticides. So, which is something we, want them to do. So yeah, anything tree related. Primarily, I kind of have a dual role in Amarillo. I'm the West Texas Ops Forester for the Panhandle region. So that means, anybody has any tree management questions, like, they have a large area of land, they want to, manage it for, the trees they have on their property, or they want to forest it, or, maybe just plant a few trees. I'm there to answer those questions and help planning and help with those management plans. Primarily, I help up here. I help a lot of people with planning windbreaks. I mean, it's so windy. Everybody with a little bit of land, seems to want a windbreak, which we're happy to help them with. That's the main goal of the nursery in Idalou, is it's to provide low cost quality seedlings to private landowners so that they can plant those windbreaks, because that tends to be the big thing that drives people, at least smaller landowners, off of planting these windbreaks. I also double duty as the urban forester, so that means I'm the forester for the agency for Amarillo and right now Lubbock. So that involves mainly a lot of sick tree calls, a lot of people like, hey, I'm having this issue, I don't know what's going on, can you help me? In Lubbock, we have a little bit of oak wilt, so I get a lot of, oh my gosh, my tree's dying, is it oak wilt? And having to go out and help them with that. Just kind of a resource, to help people figure out what's going on with their trees. You might have heard of other things like the emerald ash borer or other invasive pests. If there's issues that people have with that, where they're concerned about seeing that, or like I said, oak wilt, I'll definitely go out and check that out, give them more information, and help them if there is an issue with one of those pests. Hope that answers your question. Let's see, it looks like we have another one coming here. What are the negative aspects of encouraging tree planting in areas not known for having large amounts of trees? Can this impact native species, and what about water needed to propagate? It can. I mean, it can have a negative impact depending on what you're planting and how much you're planting. That's why generally, when I'm recommending species, when our agency recommends species, the tree species we recommend are based on the county or the area of the state. They might not always be native trees, but they are trees that are well suited for the area. And that means that they're gonna do well in the area, but not become an invasive problem. Something where we've seen, up here, where an invasive problem is the Siberian elms. USDA encouraged everybody to plant them back in the 50s, and now they're, having lots of disease problems and falling apart. But I don't know about y'all's gardens, but for the life of me, I get 5 new elm seedlings a year in my garden, and it just takes all my effort to get those things out. It drives me nuts. So, that's part of it, is making sure that we are suggesting appropriate species. I do sometimes suggest stuff that isn't native, but for windbreak trees, the big one down in y'all's region that we suggest is the Afghan pine. It's a fast growing tree. Obviously it's not native to Texas or even America, given its name, but it's, well adapted to the area. It's a drought hardy tree. It doesn't take that much water. There are, animals that use those trees. There's some pests and disease that can kill those trees, which is also good when you're bringing in a non-native species. You want it to be able to be controlled some, but they also won't just go crazy and take over. As far as like grasses and stuff, that's where you got to be careful about where you're planting things. You obviously don't want to go in and plant in a windbreak where you might have an area where you have some endangered or threatened species. And that's more of just knowing the land, that you're working on, or the land that you own, knowing what's there. And that's the importance of familiarizing yourself with those species. Really, I know we don't traditionally think of having a lot of trees here, but we really do if you start really looking at it. I mean, every draw, every drainage throughout, Amarillo area, through Panhandle, down into y'all's area. I mean, they all have trees in them. And some of those trees are several hundred years old, which goes back before, Europeans were in the area. So, it can be an issue. It's just one of those things that you have to take into account when you're planting. Some native species for Lubbock and West Texas. You have the soapberry, just off the top of my head. Let's see. I actually have a list sitting on my desk, native and naturalized species of Texas. Let me just glance over to make sure I'm not missing anything. You have your soapberry, you have your junipers, your redberry juniper. I've actually found they don't quite get down to Lubbock. They go down into the Palo Duro Canyon and then the draws down in there. You have Rocky Mountain juniper. Bur oaks are native up here. Shumard oaks. Those are just a few off the top of my head that I can think of. We do have a website. It is, let me make sure I'm giving y'all the right one here. It is Texas Tree Planting, all one word, .tamu.edu. And this is run by our agency. It's our Texas Tree Planting Guide. Here, I'm going to pop this up here just so you can see. And as you can see, it's got the express tree selector, custom tree selector, which that's what I like to tell people to use. You can actually go in here by county. And so let's see, Lubbock County, answer these questions, as needed, depending on your area. Let's say, you have a large area, you want medium trees, don't care if they're deciduous or evergreen, but you want Texas natives and you want them to be drought tolerant. And you click show trees, and here's a list of trees that are good for Lubbock County that meet those requirements. And I encourage people to explore it. It's kind of fun to go through and look at it and explore and see what's available in your area. And again, those are all Texas natives. Are they all native to the Lubbock area? I don't, red cedar might not quite be considered that. Walnut might be a little, they're Texas native, but I don't know how many of them were actually traditionally found in this area. So that is, one thing, one resource y'all can use. Again, on that tree selector, you have, underneath that third selection is just some basic tips on planting and care for trees, things to think about when you're planting and when you're maintaining trees.
All right, anybody else have any questions? Well, Kevin, thank you, and I'm sorry about the technical problems in the beginning.
Oh, that's all right. We're all learning here.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin.
Oh, thank you for having me. I enjoyed giving the talk. Again, if any of y'all have any questions, feel free to call me. I think, well, I closed it out already. You can find me on the main TFS website, the Texas A&M Forest Service website. You can find me under the contact us.
I have contact information too.
You have my information, so yeah, if you'd like to send it out to everybody, that would be great.
Okay, I sure will.
And again, I'll look up those indicator species and send you that list tomorrow.
Okay.
All right.
Everybody says thank you, Kevin.
Well, thank you all, and I look forward to maybe getting to attend to one of y'all's meetings in person one of these days. So
that'd be nice.
Everybody stay safe, and y'all have a good evening.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.